what I would want a reader to do is just dive right in. Go pick up Julius Caesar, dive right into it, and as soon as you hit a word or line that you don't understand, that's okay. Keep going, pass over. You'll get the content of most of the scene, and even if there are particular cruxes and difficulties, don't let those, or lines that you don't understand, don't let those intimidate you from the whole.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
We're joined today by Benedict Whalen, who is a professor of English at Hillsdale College and a friend of ISI. He taught last year at ISI's Honors Conference, and he'll be teaching again this year at the Honors Conference. So this podcast, I think, is long overdue, but Ben, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we'd love to start with, who are you? How did you get to Hillsdale? What are your research interests? Why do you love English?
Thanks. So I've been at Hillsdale for 10 years now and settled in nicely here. I actually grew up in Hillsdale, so it's a return to roots for me. But as an undergraduate, I went to the University of Dallas. And I went there thinking I'd probably study English, but actually when I was an undergraduate, I intended to be a lawyer. So I went into UD thinking I would take a degree in English and go into law. But I distinctly remember as a junior, I took this class on Renaissance British literature, and I recall reading Shakespeare's Henriade, his English history tetralogy, the second tetralogy, and as I was reading it, I felt like the ground was slipping from under me because I realized that I was falling so in love and so deeply interested in this that my whole career plan, the trajectory of everything I thought I was going to do was shifting, and that I actually, over the course of the semester, realized I had to go to graduate school. I had to give years to Shakespeare and to the study of Shakespeare, and so that was what I did. And since then, I'm happily a Shakespeare lover and student and teacher at Hillsdale now.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Excellent. And our listener question this week sort of, I think, ties to that nicely. So ask you, and then Marlo, want to hear your thoughts as well. The listener asks what your suggestion is for students who are interested in the liberal arts, perhaps English, but worry that it will hinder their career prospects or won't be economically viable. What would you tell a student?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that along with a knowledge of the English literary tradition, a degree in English at any good school will teach you excellent communication skills in reading and writing. And I think that is one of the most needed and valuable skills on the job market. So we get this question all the time at Hillsdale with our students who are a little bit anxious, or their parents will be a little bit anxious. What can you do with English other than teach? And for us, it's always just assuring them, look, don't worry about it. Employers are clamoring for Hillsdale graduates with English degrees in all sorts of fields, because somebody who can write an effective email, who can read even, say, law and render it intelligible to others in their writing is an extremely valuable skill. And so I think English is a wonderful discipline, and in general, study in the liberal arts, in history, in politics, philosophy, because these both speak to the deepest questions that we have as humans, and really speak to and help shape our intellects and souls. But they also really do become then also, it's like a secondary benefit, is that they're actually very valuable on the market. If you can write well and if you can use language persuasively, that's just a good and very valuable.
Yeah, I love this question because I think it's a question as old as time, at least, from the time I was a student, and it's still being asked today, especially with the the number of students who are going to school, and also the, there's so many concerns about the declining quality of these programs, especially if you're a conservative parent. Maybe you can't send your student to Hillsdale, for example, and it's kind of a limited space of, I went to a progressive school and I studied poetry there. So as you can imagine, like my experience, I was not reading Milton or Shakespeare for that matter. I was reading I won't even go into detail what I was reading, but let me just tell you, it was not, the edifying, liberal arts English program that I was hoping to participate in. So I think the quality of the program is a big thing. But also, if you go to something I like to do sometimes is whenever I hear about, for example, my husband works in the tech space and he studied philosophy and now he works in venture capital. And there's this kind of pipeline from things like philosophy, for example, and I'm sure you can find this in other humanities fields, but the pipeline from philosophy, which usually does require, logical, systematic thinkers into fields that require that same type of aptitude, is very strong. So you'll see founders of companies studied, XYZ humanities at Stanford. So I think that's a really strong, there's a strong connection between I think there's a selection effect at play, especially at these really good schools. And Hillsdale, of course, is probably the best school to go to if you're looking for a really, really solid, especially English major and exploration of these great, the canonical works of English literature. So yeah, I think if you ever want to if you're listening to this and you're a student who's studying one of these and you're thinking one of these majors and you're thinking, what am I going to do after college? I implore you to go on a quick Wikipedia search, look up these different high profile figures and see what they studied in college. Because in my experience, rarely do I come across some of these, high profile individuals who are, great leaders, or whether they're entrepreneurs or, running whatever, some sort of institution. Do I find that they went through business school or something? Sometimes it really is just they studied philosophy at a good school, and then whatever happened afterwards built on the skills and the critical learning skills that they learned as an undergraduate at I think of course I asterisk good school. You want to make sure that it's a quality program. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't know, Tom, maybe you had, because you went to a private school, but it seemed like it was probably just as progressive as the public school I went to. So maybe your experience is similar to mine.
Yeah, BC is also a very progressive school, but I was very lucky and blessed with the philosophy department that was very classical and systematic in its thinking and its programming. So, and with an incredible faculty. So I guess I would maybe get something equivalent to what you'd get at a Hillsdale philosophy undergrad program at BC, just because of the faculty and the mindset and what their aims were for imparting the knowledge and the love of wisdom onto students. But I mean, the one thing that really stuck with me was from when I was an ISI honors student. I was having a conversation with another Hillsdale professor, Bill McClay, and he said, I hear from parents and students who talk about, I need to have an education that's useful. And he just says, but what do you mean by use? Do you mean the sort of narrow technical skills that will get you a job or get you working at, McKinsey? We need people to work at McKinsey. We need especially many people working in the trades and in manufacturing, things like that. But education is civilization. It's a project of cultivating people who are equipped for, with the virtues and dispositions towards self-government in the case of our politics, but in other political orders or in other ways of life about, what it means to be a human being, how to understand our own freedom well. So I think that's something that's always stuck well with me. So we've got to, I think, expand what we mean when we talk about use. I agree with McClay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tom. And I mean, we have to think about it. What's the goal here? And the goal, think of any parent with their child will think, of course, I want my child to be able to earn an income and have a sort of a flourishing life, even in material terms. But antecedent to that, and much more important to that, is the shaping of the human person. Right? I don't want my children to grow up to just be good little worker bees, right? I want their whole soul, their intellect, their imagination to be shaped by confronting, the best of what's been thought and said. And then I think if we have shaped the human person and the human intellect well in these ways, then they will go on and succeed when it comes to other practical applications of a well-formed intellect to the problems of a particular job or field. But it's the shaping of the person that is the real end and purpose of education.
Absolutely. And it's so obvious, and I'm sure Marla can speak to the same thing, how when we have students who are clearly very well formed, how impressive they are. That's not just impressive to us because we're maybe a little geeky or we're interested in ideas, but like when you go out, you're a person who's well formed and everyone will probably intuitively recognize that. So maybe let's turn now to Shakespeare, which is, I think, the main meat of our subject. And personally, I read a lot of Shakespeare in college. You'll chastise me for this, Ben, but I never took a college English class because I AP'd out of my classes. And so I went on to all the philosophy. But I want to start personally with Alan Bloom because I'm reading Closing of the American Mind right now. And in a sort of throwaway line, he talks about how like the modern literary studies, and that sort of maybe forms the centerpiece or the centerpiece of the thinking of English departments. And he's writing this in the 1980s, but I would wonder if it's still true. They've disregarded the political teachings of someone like Shakespeare or maybe like Poe, other of these great literary figures and great writers that would be the subject of studies in English departments. And so I'm wondering if you agree that that's the case, and what is lost if when we're reading Shakespeare, we're disregarding or not paying attention to or inattentive to the political significance of works or the themes of Shakespeare's writing.
Yeah, Bloom is right, and I'm afraid that the English department has almost been the vanguard of the sort of general trend in American academia, which is that we are drifting away from any sense of a canon, a received body of learning that educated people should know, and that we all study together. And English departments now, unfortunately, most of them have moved away from the study of any sort of canonical set of greats and much more towards not just contemporary, but maybe secondary authors of significance and interest, but that aren't part of some whole coherent curriculum. And so what we often see is that people majoring in English take a smattering of classes from all sorts of periods and all sorts of different genres and literary traditions. And that doesn't end up being a coherent education. Instead, it's a sort of disparate and fragmented education. And that is wedded to what we often find in English is a very politicized bent to the discipline, so that English departments tend to be hotbeds of activism and sort of trendy political movements of the contemporary time, rather than, say, places where we are seeking to understand what Shakespeare might have to teach us, where he might lead us in his wisdom and insight, and how we might come to know things about virtue, about ourselves, about our literary tradition, about God, that's so. It's Bloom is right. I'm afraid that's just the unfortunate state of things. It's not universal, but it's a real loss. And part of what I'm working on right now, in fact, is a book for. I think I'm titling it Shakespeare for Classical Education, because I think this classical education movement in America is a wonderful thing. And I think Shakespeare, right, and these great authors, Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton, they have a privileged place within a classical education. They're undeniably great authors that illuminate things about the human condition and lead us to better understand ourselves and what we should live for and how we should order our lives. So my hope in that work is to help establish Shakespeare within classical education. We shouldn't lose him. I think it's vitally important that we do study him and treasure him and hold on to him.
So what would you say to maybe listeners of this episode who are thinking like the last time they read Shakespeare was maybe in like English in the 10th grade or something, and maybe that kind of created like this memory of feeling lost and maybe going line by line with their professor and giving it this very, like mutilated kind of fragmented look at these sections of the reading that I'm sure to a 10th grader can be very intimidating, especially if you're not in this classical learning environment where, or even, a homeschool co-op where you might receive that more individualized approach that's tailored to student. And I could totally see how, like, I went to a public school in that sort of setting. Yeah, Shakespeare's really intimidating. It's scary. Like, you're all at different learning levels for the most part, and there's just not enough time to be able to give it the justice that sort of reading needs. So what would you say to maybe someone listening to this podcast who's thinking like, yeah, I like the idea of reading Shakespeare, but I don't know how to do it. And what can make it less intimidating for someone who wants to, dive right in after a hiatus of 10, 20, 30, 40 years since the last time they picked up, The Tempest with their high school English teacher?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marlo. It's Shakespeare's intimidating because not only is his poetry really rich and philosophically serious, but just the language, the Elizabethan language. It is modern English. I always joke with students who think, oh, this has got to be old English, right? What Shakespeare wrote, but it's not. It's modern English. But of course it is still dated, and we don't quite speak that way, and lots of the words will be difficult. So that poetry presents a real challenge. And if I was to say to somebody who's maybe intimidated but interested, like, oh, you know what, maybe I should pick up a Shakespeare. What I would recommend is this. First of all, get an edition that just presents the text to you pretty cleanly. For instance, the Folger Shakespeare Library editions of Shakespeare present the text cleanly on one side with notes on the other side that are just glosses on the words. Those can be very useful. Those are less intimidating than, say, the Arden Shakespeare series, where sometimes you'll have so many footnotes that you only have about 3 lines of poetry on a page, and then the rest is double-columned footnotes running down. That's intimidating and scary. And for an amateur reader of Shakespeare, that it's just unnecessary. We don't need all of that critical and scholarly background. What I would want a reader to do is just dive right in. Go pick up Julius Caesar, dive right into it. And as soon as you hit a word or line that you don't understand, that's okay. Keep going, pass over. You'll get the content of most of the scene. And even if there are particular cruxes and difficulties, don't let those or lines that you don't understand, don't let those intimidate you from the whole, because you can read a scene from Shakespeare and not understand quite a few words, quite a few lines, and still actually by the end of the scene understand what's going on. And maybe you can pause and say, what are the principal concerns Shakespeare has here? And what is he leading me to understand, say, about Julius Caesar or about justice and tyranny? And it turns out that if you just dive in and read through and don't let yourself get bogged down in footnotes or lines that you don't understand, you come to some really important questions and really, really deep topics very quickly. It can be really fruitful. One other thing I would recommend to people is it's always helpful to read in community or in conversation. So, just read it with your spouse and make it, just an evening that you can spend with your spouse where hey, we're going to talk about the first act of Julius Caesar, or with your children out loud. This is in fact traditionally been one of the ways that Shakespeare's been treated. I was just reading a biography of Patton, George Patton, and he grew up as a child. His aunt and his father would just read Shakespeare out loud to the family in the evenings, and that can be a very fruitful and delightful way. And you just think of little George Patton didn't understand all of these lines, but he got the gist, and he also got the sense of the greatness of what a great general, great soldier would be, and the virtues that he would have, and what manly fortitude is like, and that's imparted even despite the difficulties of Elizabethan English and certain particular lines. So I would say just dive right in and read it with somebody, and you'll end up having great conversations, and you will learn more readily than you think you will if you just read through a scene of Shakespeare.
I have a follow-up question to that, because I think maybe I spoke with you about this. You taught at our honors conference this past year, and you'll be teaching again this summer. And something that I noticed, and I talk to poets that I know and like practicing poets and other writers. And I think the way that we approach reading and writing is it's almost in this very ritualistic way that I think could be more casually approached. Like one of my colleagues, Jane Charles, actually, she's a practicing poet. And she says like, yeah, I never read poetry like sitting down. I'm doing it while I'm like cooking, or I'm, maybe I'm not necessarily like multitasking in the sense that my brain's scattered and it's in 3 different places, because obviously if you're you're a novice picking up Shakespeare for the first time, you want to be present. But it seems like at least for me, just knowing, friends who are, adjacent to my world, or maybe I went to school with them or something like that, that can seem like it just seems like it's almost like breaking the script in some way. Like in school, you're taught to like sit down and formally read Shakespeare, but maybe this is more of a commentary that you could give on how we approach, the act of reading great books, the act of reading poetry and plays, and what that activity looks like, what it ought to look like. Are we just doing that all wrong? Because, you're talking about how to read Shakespeare, and it seems like it's a lot more accessible than this more formalized setting that we're probably accustomed to in like a college classroom or lecture hall or a high school classroom.
Yeah, I completely agree. You can have fun with Shakespeare, and actually, he'll give you food for thought. He'll give you a little like spark in the imagination, even if you just read one scene. Reading Shakespeare doesn't need to be, okay, I need to find 5 hours of unbroken silence where I can sit here with my big tome and work through the play. It should be delightful. It should be. You can think of the way the Roman poet Horace in his Ars Poetica describes poetry as dulce et utile. That is, it's sweet and useful. It imparts learning and leads you to a certain form of knowledge while being delightful. And so yeah, we definitely, if we're ritualizing the reading of Shakespeare in a way that sterilizes the setting and makes it just formal academic study, we're losing half the point, which is that this should be a delight. It should lead us through love and delight to its fruits. So there's where I'll be happy to read a scene out loud with your high schooler instead of studying it. Just divvy up some parts, read some scenes, or challenge a high schooler to a memorization competition. Who can recite these lines from Julius Caesar better? And that it can sort of impart games, but then we will come to know the characters, to know Shakespeare's themes more as well. So I do, yeah, we shouldn't have it be too sterile. Shakespeare is always alive, and it can be helpful to get out of your seat and even perform Shakespeare in some sort of amateur way, and that can be really fun. Even there, when you think of reading Shakespeare out loud with others, that itself will present really interesting interpretive questions for Shakespeare. Even if you're just with a couple of friends and you say, hey, how would we actually stage this scene? We're not actors. We're not really going to put on a production, but even just how would you stage this? Or do you think these lines are said in a loud or in a reserved manner? You can think of famously, Hamlet's very first line is, his uncle has turned to him and he says, now Hamlet, and Hamlet says, a little more than kin and less than kind, describing their relationship. Well, it's an interesting question. Is that stated angrily right to his uncle's face, or is that sort of muttered under his breath in a reserved way? These are fruitful questions that, even if you're just doing this with friends, come to help lead you to a better understanding of Hamlet's character. So yeah, make it alive, make it sweet, let it dance off the page.
This sounds really fun. I have an aunt and uncle and my 2 cousins who are very into theater and very into. He actually played. My younger cousin played Prospero in his, I think it was high school or middle school performance of The Tempest. So I'm gonna have to do this with them now. So this is great. Yeah. What do you recommend in terms of plays for the amateur reader? Like, how do you get started, but what should you get started on? Would you recommend Julius Caesar, something else? I started with Romeo and Juliet. Any of your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's great. I think those are great places to start, and I think, for instance, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. It's not too long. It's a very accessible play. It moves pretty quickly. The when we think of Renaissance literature, the very word Renaissance means a rebirth, and what it in part is a rebirth of is classical antiquity in some way, the learning and the traditions and the understanding from classical antiquity. So it's very, very interesting to look at what is Shakespeare's understanding of ancient Rome. And Roman greatness and this great general, and it's very fruitful to just see what does Shakespeare think of ancient Rome, especially say the movement over the course of Julius Caesar, the movement of Rome into empire fully, right? Where this is no longer republic but empire. What does Shakespeare think of monarchy, of empire, of republics, and so that's very fruitful. Julius Caesar is a great one to begin with. Romeo and Juliet is an excellent play. That's one where I think Shakespeare is engaged with the Italian poet Petrarch, and Shakespeare is trying to correct the conventions of the Petrarchan lover, who is always unhappy and it's not reciprocated love, and he is writing about his beloved in isolation, alone. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is a response to that, where we have Romeo and Juliet when they first meet, their language, their lines weave together into a sonnet. It's very, very beautiful. It's this sort of new, robust, living love poetry. That's a great play. Romeo and Juliet is such a well-known play culturally. We all know the story, that it could maybe turn us off, where we could think, oh, I know that story, etc. I encourage you, go read it. It's hilarious. It's lively. It will surprise you even if you think you know the story. That's a great place to begin. Another great one is A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's just delightful. It's full of joy. It got all these wonderful jokes. It's a very rich play. Those are good places to begin. But if you want to cut your teeth on a little bit more, Macbeth. If you want to get into the tragedies, Macbeth is a great one, and it's very quick. You only have to read for 10 minutes before you're anchored to it as you watch this man make these terrible, tragic decisions in his ambition. Those are maybe a couple that I would go to right off the bat.
Awesome.
What are some ways that you would say Shakespeare continues to influence, maybe without us even knowing, modern language or contemporary language today? Because I personally think of the term, and maybe this isn't as well used as the second phrase I'll bring up, but like a Falstaffian character. So someone who's like kind of portly and, debauched and kind of like rotund. It almost reminds me of like the Pumblechook character from Great Expectations in his physique. And so I see that kind of referenced occasionally to describe someone who's, corpulent. But there's also the term star-crossed lovers, which you mentioned Romeo and Juliet. People might think they know what it's about until they actually read it. And star-crossed lovers, you kind of need to like Google it to learn what it means, because it's like actually like kind of morbid, can be used morbidly. So are there other ways that you see Shakespeare influencing culture today, maybe with or without us knowing it? And are there ways that you think that because I've seen a number of stories about these public, the Shakespeare in the Park, different performances. And, they've obviously been influenced in some ways by, I hate to use the term woke culture, but I'm going to use it for just the sake of expedience. And so these things are being, I think, heavily politicized, especially in the curriculum that is designed to maybe 10, 20 years ago, Shakespeare would be just a staple of an English class, right? But now, obviously, there are other considerations that make Shakespeare not as likely to be selected as perhaps, a curriculum that prioritizes other things. So what would you say with like ways that we can appreciate Shakespeare for the cultural influence that he's given us as as Americans who draw heavily from the English tradition. And do you see some, are you concerned at all with maybe Shakespeare being taken out of, like even at the public school level, certain curriculums, or otherwise being framed as as not being a necessary component of that education?
Yeah, I'm afraid it really does concern me, and it's a growing. I don't know if it's putting it too strongly to call it a movement, but if you read education journals today, you will see teachers are regularly saying, "Why should I teach Shakespeare? Dead white male literature is not pertinent to my classroom. No one understands this is difficult anyway. Can't we read something modern and something relevant?" You'll see this all the time. Now there's also, Shakespeare is still in the canon enough that a lot of people, even people with very progressive politics, will find much work that they can do with Shakespeare that they find sympathetic to their political ends, etc. But to read and study Shakespeare is to continually learn more about yourself and your own contemporary language and setting. For instance, Martin Luther King Jr. Quotes Shakespeare all the time in his speeches, and so if you've read your King, then you go into reading Shakespeare and you discover, he was drawing on that. There are all these sources, and quoting Shakespeare tends to impart rhetorical power, and it invokes a certain tradition. So we see it in our politics also, and in our arts. I'm just remembering off the top of my head that I think in the 2016 election, I remember a theater group put on Julius Caesar and made the Julius Caesar who's assassinated in the third act. They gave him Donald Trump's hair. And it was a pointed political comment that they were trying to make, and a very violent one. And so Shakespeare is alive in our politics, in our culture, in our media, very much. And to study Shakespeare is to become aware of maybe some of the ways in which different people are using him, and the power that he gives them. So I think it is empowering to study Shakespeare, to understand how he's shaped our language and how different people are deploying his works and his language in our debates today.
I know you're going to be speaking about Julius Caesar at our honors conference, and so I'm sure you've not, written your full-on remarks yet. But I'm curious. This is just like maybe a slight departure for a second. During the Peloponnesian War, the Euripides writes the Trojan Women, and so I read the Trojan Women while we were studying the history of the Peloponnesian War as a sort of an aside commentary about what it would be like to go to war, what it would mean for the home and the hearth back home if you were to lose, or what it means for your civilization to be destroyed and your women and children to be sent off, and of things of that sort. And so I'm wondering, Shakespeare is alive during the Renaissance, but there's also the wars of religion. There's a lot of war. Is Shakespeare, and to what extent is Shakespeare and Julius Caesar and some of the tetralogies of his historical plays like Richard III and Henry IV, Henry V? How is he responding or making various political points with respect to his own contemporaneous struggles going on?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. So Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar under Queen Elizabeth I, a very strong, authoritative monarch, and this is in the last decade of her reign. She dies in 1603, but so it's remarkable to think about Shakespeare writing a play about the assassination of a monarchic figure under such a strong monarch as Elizabeth. And people in Shakespeare's time were definitely aware that even when you're talking about ancient Rome or Greece, we're also talking about today. And so there was basically a censor's office under Queen Elizabeth where you would have to get your play approved by the master of revels in order to be allowed to stage it, because they understood that the theater and the arts moves people and leads them to draw certain conclusions, and can be very could undermine the monarch or the monarch's policies. There famously, for instance, there was an uprising against Queen Elizabeth, and in that uprising, they staged Shakespeare's Richard II, and they staged it because it's a play where a monarch is deposed, and so they're marching towards London, and in the evening they put on this play. That's just one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, and we have a note that. At one point, Queen Elizabeth said to one of her advisors, "I am Richard II. Know ye not that?" She understood also that just to stage this could be a commentary on her, and so I think that's I think that's an important part. Shakespeare's art is very powerful, and the way in which we stage it and the way in which we talk about it can move people. They move people in Shakespeare's day and can move people in our day. I'm also just now I'm recalling also. I'm interested in how Americans read and receive Shakespeare. And one interesting one, the story of Coriolanus, is another ancient Roman set play of Shakespeare's. And in that story, Coriolanus, this great Roman warrior, is actually banished from Rome because he is so aristocratic and disparaging towards the common populace. They can't stand this aristocratic but very mighty warrior. So he's banished from Rome. So he goes to the enemy and leads their army up to Rome. And so Rome is about to fall at the hands of her own soldier. And very interestingly, the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Army outside of Boston staged Shakespeare's Coriolanus. And of course, we can say that makes sense because it's a play full of war and martial virtue, and so they could be let's get the British. But I think also that it was the Continental Congress had not paid them recently, and so I think in a way the Continental Army was its threat is too strong a word, but just sort of gesturing it. You guys need to take care of your soldiers, or bad things could happen. And so it's very interesting to see when in these different periods that they were staging Shakespeare in Shakespeare's own time, using it as potential threats to the monarch in the American Revolutionary period, and then even in our own time, we can clearly see how this is used as it's the arts, but it's also part of the sort of common cultural moment. And Shakespeare is a powerful influence in that.
So we're discussing a lot of these heavy themes, and but it also, I think, might help listeners to hear that if you haven't touched a play by Shakespeare before, that he's actually funny too. And he does have these moments where, you're reading and there are elements of humor in there as well. So could you talk about how that humor functions in his works? And if there's anything in particular that you'd recommend listeners who are interested in finding a piece that maybe incorporates some of these heavier themes and, these more, larger, more, just topics like self-governance, and there's so many different transcendent themes as well, but also the element of humor that gives us that relief.
Yeah. Well, Marlo, you already mentioned Falstaff, and Falstaff is a character in Shakespeare's in two of Shakespeare's English history plays, Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. And even just the sound of that, most Americans, I think, couldn't really tell you much about Henry IV's reign, and just Part 1 and Part 2. This sounds very distant, but those plays contain Falstaff, and he's one of the larger than life characters in Shakespeare's canon, and he is hilarious. He's absolutely hilarious. And how does the humor come in? In a couple of different ways. Part of the way that Falstaff is hilarious is just his verbal wit. He's close friends with the Prince of Wales, who will grow up to be Henry V. And a lot of the play looks at their relationship and their friendship. And we see them having a lot of verbal interplay and dialogue. But then there are also situations. So we see Prince Hal, Henry V, to be pranking Falstaff to show that he's a coward in these different ways. And so we have both, in other words, situational comedy and then also verbal comedy in the witty play. Those are both, we see that again and again in Shakespeare's works. Falstaff is a particularly great example. And for readers or for listeners here who might not have the time to sit down and read through those plays, I love to recommend. There's a very, very well produced version of the whole history tetralogy that goes Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and then Henry V, done by the BBC in, I think, 2012, called The Hollow Crown. It's very cheap. It's very affordable on Amazon. You can stream all four, and it's A-list, top-quality actors. Simon Russell Beale does Falstaff. Tom Hiddleston is Henry V, Prince Hal. It's just beautiful, and those episodes, Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2, if you go and watch those, you'll see that we're looking at the education of a Christian prince at the same time as we have all this humor. So we get all of this play and dialogue and comedy at the same time as we have very serious questions of how should we educate the future rulers what would be the ideal of a Christian ruler here. So those I recommend those, and it's a great example of, you'll be laughing, and then you'll also see very, very serious questions and themes.
Ben, we could talk for hours and hours, but we have limited time. So I want to ask you one more question about Shakespeare. And not his personal relationship to religion, though. Feel free to say anything about that you know that you think is relevant or interesting. But his understanding or his use of religious themes, or his sort of commentary on religion that comes through various of his plays. The use of, in Julius Caesar, the symbolism in Act 1, Scene 3 about Casca seeing the lion, and how that might relate to Shakespeare. But these various fates or symbolic, spiritual things, ghosts and things like that, and probably more so in the history plays, more religious themes.
This was actually one of my principal areas of interest with Shakespeare is Shakespeare's engagement. He's writing at the same time as the Reformation, and I'm very interested in how Shakespeare's plays show or reflect contemporary theological arguments. Right. So it's quite interesting to see how Shakespeare talks about grace and sin and mercy and forgiveness. These are major themes. They're very prominent for Shakespeare. Shakespeare is not simply a religious allegorist, and he's not. He doesn't engage in religious polemic of the day, but he's a deeply religious writer, and these themes are of central importance to him. So here's one example. In the middle of Hamlet, Hamlet has the murder of his father reenacted by a traveling group of actors in front of his uncle, who is the murderer, and Hamlet's trying to make sure if he knows. Hamlet's trying to make sure that he is sure that his uncle was the murderer. So he has this reenacted, and he's watching how his uncle responds. Well, after that, the uncle gets up, and he's very disturbed seeing this reenactment of his grave sin, the murder of his brother. And so Claudius jumps up, and then he goes off to his closet to pray. And we get this scene where Claudius is alone in soliloquy, and he's struggling with his soul and trying to work himself up to repentance. And in that moment, it's very interesting to look at, well, what is this, the understanding of repentance and of the soul and of the soul's relationship to the will, and where is grace here, and how does one repent of a sin? How ought one to? And so we get moments that are just freighted with theological and spiritual significance in the plays. One other beautiful thing is, as a Shakespeare scholar, one of the things that I love to do as I work through Shakespeare's works is you see a growing depth of understanding and representation of mercy and forgiveness over the course of Shakespeare's career. So Shakespeare's late plays like The Tempest and The Winter's Tale and Cymbeline, these are just shot through with the themes of mercy and forgiveness. It's almost as if older Shakespeare, as he's winding to the end of his career, commits himself to mercy and forgiveness. So really beautiful. You get beautiful theological reflections in those plays.
Well, thank you, Ben. This has been great. And for students who are going to be at the honors conference or who have applied and maybe don't get in, hopefully this has been a fun and informative, maybe a forward to more things to come. But Ben, you mentioned you're working on a book. Where can people find that? I don't know if it's going to be out yet, or other things that you've done that you'd like to share with our audience and point in their direction.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's not out yet. I hope to finish it this spring, and then I'll be approaching presses with it. It hopefully will be a book. Basically, my hope is to help readers access Shakespeare and to redirect them to Shakespeare. So I have little essays meditating on 10 of Shakespeare's plays, and then one of the other chief aims of the book is that I'm trying to put Shakespeare's works in conversation with the great books tradition, and that tradition particularly with respect to virtue and the formation of virtue. So I try to place plays like we might think about justice and forgiveness, and think about those virtues in Julius Caesar, or we could think of prodigality and liberality with the Merchant of Venice. Different, and so in the book, I'll draw on Plato, on Aristotle, on Cicero, on Seneca, and Dante, Thomas Aquinas, and give little excerpts to put them in conversation with what we see from Shakespeare. So I'm not sure when I'll be finished with this. I hope in a couple of months, but I am excited for it. My goal is that the book should be for students and teachers, and that anyone should just be able to read it, and it hopefully help us study and fall in love with Shakespeare. That would be my goal. If I can make one other recommendation, for those who just want a little book of simple essays, it's not too academic or stodgy or tight-laced. There's a great book from about 100 years ago by Mark Van Doren, just called Shakespeare, and it's in print from the New York Review of Books, I think. And he just has little 3, 4, 5-page essays on each of Shakespeare's plays, and they just introduce you to the principal themes and a way of thinking about each of the plays. It's very accessible. It's a lovely, lovely collection of essays. So that's something I'd recommend for readers who just want to start reading a little bit about Shakespeare.
Awesome. And when your book comes out, you'll have to send it to us, and we'll have to do a part 2 on this. So thanks again, Ben.
I sure will. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.